Welcome to the Church Leadership Podcast, your weekly source for encouraging and equipping local church leaders, with your hosts, Mark Gainey and Andy Frazier. In each episode, Andy and Mark sit down with church leaders that you should know. We believe these honest conversations will be helpful and encouraging to you as you lead the local church. Here is this week's episode.
Welcome to today's episode of the Church Leadership Podcast. I'm so excited, really about every episode, but specifically today's episode and our conversation that we have today. And our mission is the same at Church Leadership Podcast, week in and week out, and it's to encourage and equip leaders in the local church to be disciples that make disciples. And we believe today's conversation is going to help you do that. It's going to be encouraging in that regard. So before we get to the conversation, though, I do want to remind you, make sure you subscribe. And look, I know I say this every episode, but it's true. You only listen to the podcast that you subscribe to, usually. So we don't want you to miss a single episode. Hit subscribe. Maybe it's your first time watching or listening. Maybe you're watching on YouTube or listening to your favorite podcast app. Well, look, go ahead and hit subscribe. If you absolutely hate this, then you can always unsubscribe later. So make sure that you subscribe to the podcast. We want you to be a part of every episode. So Andy, here's today's conversation.
We are absolutely excited about our guests today. And I have my own personal reasons why I'm excited that we have a special guest with us today. We have Dr. David Gainey, which is a familiar name to many of you who listen and watch the podcast. David is Mark's brother. David is the founding pastor of Oasis. It's a church in Tucson, Arizona. It's about to celebrate its 25th anniversary. And David, we are excited about the conversation today. When we began our time talking earlier before we started recording, I asked David two questions. How do you want to be introduced? And can you tell me something embarrassing about Mark? So we're going to get to that second question before this episode's over with today.
Yeah, I'm afraid of that.
David, we're so glad you can join us on the podcast this week.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
So those of you watching on YouTube, you probably by now have already began to notice the similarities and mannerism, familiarity between my brother and I, but he's my older brother. And so he's my big brother. And it is true that not everything, but almost everything in my life was encouraged or inspired by my brother. And that's kind of us little brothers. That's what we do. So it is really a joy to have you on the podcast. And probably the reason we waited until, this point to have you is because I am afraid of that second question that Andy mentioned, but we'll get there anyway. But David, I'm so glad you're on the podcast. And listen, so I've obviously followed your journey as your brother over these last 25 years. I remember the day that you moved to Tucson. And I remember the trauma that our family endured as you left Alabama to go to Tucson, Arizona, because you felt like God was calling you to that area. And so I've watched from afar now God use you as the founding pastor, and how that church has made an impact in that community, that neighborhood, that area. But here's what I want to ask you. First of all, talk a little bit about specifically your calling to that area. Because to me, that story is fascinating, but also talk about maybe why you stayed, because a lot of church planters, as you were at one point, they plant a church, they're there for a little bit and they leave. Right. They're starters, serial starters, but that's not God's call on your life. And that's not your heart. You've been there 25 years now. We talked about it before we hit record. You're not a church planter anymore. You're the founding pastor. You're the pastor. And so talk a little bit about your journey in Oasis and how God has worked through Oasis.
Yeah. Well, the first question was how I got out here. I had gone to Beeson Divinity School, where you ended up in Birmingham, and I had met my wife in Birmingham, married her shortly after starting Beeson. And before I even got to grad school, I was already feeling like I wanted to start a church. There's something fresh about not inheriting somebody else's problems, but making your own mess. And somebody else has to inherit your problems, right? Like let the next guy be the guy that has to complain about that stuff. So I thought that would be neat, to be the guy, I don't inherit anybody else's mess. Everyone here wants to be here because of me. Like, that's very attractive. And so I really felt led to start a church while I was in college. And then when I got to grad school, as I thought about it and prayed about it, I realized that I had this passion to be a missionary. But I have a hard time learning other languages, right? So I'm like, well, what kind of missionary can I be if I'm stuck with English? I guess I could go to Australia, Great Britain, I'm limited. And then I really had a heart for being a missionary in my own country. So there was this thing in me that wanted to be a missionary, wanted to start a church in North America. I remember in grad school, I ended up going to a Southern Baptist Convention meeting in Orlando, Florida. That probably would date it. And I went there, and I was almost done with grad school. I mean, I had like a year left. And so this was probably 1994-ish. And I remember being there and going up to a booth, and the booth was by the North American Mission Board, known by its previous name at the time. And it was, the booth was called Planting Churches in Underchurched Parts of America. And I walked up to the booth and I said to the guy, the sign on your booth is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And he goes, really, do you have any place in mind? I said, we're in it, Orlando. I want to be here. This is where the magic is. I want to be in Orlando, Florida. I mean, I'm close to the beach. Like this is good stuff. And he said to me, oh, that's interesting, because we don't consider Orlando to be one of the underchurched parts of America, one unchurched cities in America. And I'm like,
your dream.
Really? He's like, well, this is not underchurched. And I'm like, it's not? He goes, no. In fact, there's only one city in the entire Southeast on our list. I said, what is that? He said, Miami. And I went, Miami?
It's not the Southeast. It's Cuba.
Who would want to go to Miami? That's why it's underchurched, right? So I heard that and I walked away and I thought, Jesus, was Orlando my idea or your idea? And I laid that down. I remember laying that down that week going, you know what? I think Orlando might be my bright idea. And I'm willing to go wherever you tell me to go. And shortly after that, I did, for the very first time in my life, which I've done maybe 20 times since then, I did Experiencing God by Henry Blackie. It was still pretty young, pretty new back then. And I went through that course around 1994, 95. And one of the things I learned from going through that was that I should be asking God, where are you working? And if God shows me where he's at work, that's the invitation. Well, that's a really mind-blowing way to approach things. And so I went through the North American Mission Board's Church Planter Apprentice Program. I got approved. My wife and I got approved as missionaries. But they don't appoint you. They leave that up to you. You have to go find a church, sponsoring church or an association or something to kind of like officially endorse you and pay, half your salary. And that was an 18-month long period. And we got calls from people in probably a third of the states in the United States. And we talked to people in Nevada, Minnesota, Ohio, Illinois. We talked to people all over the country. And we even flew up to Boston twice. We almost moved to Boston. And I thought, honestly, that if the standard was, where's God at work, that would be solved like in the first phone call. 18 months later, I still didn't have an answer to that question, because whenever I would ask, why do you want to start a church there? I would always get an answer like, well, there are no churches there. And, you said, why did I stay? My longing was to plant one church and stay at that one church the rest of my life. That was my goal from day one. I almost didn't do it. There are a couple of times I almost quit, but that was my goal. And so I would say to people, look, I want to move my wife and my kid and myself there and have the rest of my family there and raise my family there and maybe die there. You got to give me a better reason than that. And they never did until I talked to a guy in Tucson who said, well, we've got a church planter apprentice out here who has started a church. His goal is to abandon it quickly. And it's been going about 6 months. And there's a group of people there and they're hungry. And I asked questions. He gave me good answers. We flew out here, saw a hungry group of people that wanted a church. And we knew before we got on the plane to come back, God was inviting us to Tucson. And on the plane on the way back, we agreed to quit our jobs, turn in our notices. And we were here 1 month later, permanently. And there were some hard times when I wanted to just, cry and come home. But we didn't. We stayed. We stuck it out.
Yeah, listen, as two failed church planters, I'm kind of amazed that you said you almost quit twice. I mean, I almost quit twice every hour,
Well, okay.
by 9
Okay. When I
years.
say almost quit twice, I want to quit. The average pastor wants to quit 7 times a year. Before I went to Potter's Wheel, which I'm sure we'll get to later, I remember thinking the average pastor thinks about quitting 7 times a year. What kind of wusses are going into the pastorate? And then after I became emotionally healthy, because I wasn't emotionally healthy, I wasn't in touch with my feelings. After Potter's Wheel 1, I became aware of that. And as I began this journey of emotional health, the Peter Scazzaro journey, which I went on later than him, differently, but it was the same journey. When I started getting emotionally healthy, I remember thinking, just 7 times a year? Man, I think about quitting 7 times a week. So when I say I almost quit, I don't mean I thought about it. I thought about it lots of times. I mean, I really seriously almost quit, like ready to just get in the car and come home. Yeah. I think about quitting even now, but that's not almost quitting, because we suddenly realize we don't have any marketable skills, and what else can we do, and how can we feed our family, and we're stuck with this church.
Yeah, Elijah under a broom tree. That's how I consider a lot of those Monday morning moments pastors have. You just, am I the only one? God, do you care? We can have
it's just me against the prophets of Baal.
Yes, that's right. Well, David, your story is very interesting, not just in the fact that God moved you from Alabama to Tucson, but it's interesting the fact that you have this longevity of sticking with what you thought God wanted you to do. You said from day one you wanted to be somewhere and stay there a long time. And we've talked a lot about church planning here on the podcast. And most of the time, a church planner's story is they are borderline nomadic. They'll go somewhere, they'll stay, they'll start, they're apostolic, they go start something and they'll let somebody else come in and finish it. And you mentioned, it's attractive to come in and make your own mess and let somebody else come in and clean it up. So,
which is what I've done.
What would you say to people who are watching and listening who maybe they're in the church planning world and maybe they're considering, should I stay or should I look for something else? Or maybe they're about to enter into that world of church planning. They're going through the process of being, poured into and equipped and prepared to go on that journey. How would you kind of challenge or tell them something from your experience of going somewhere, digging in, planting roots, and just like Jeremiah 29, building houses and planting gardens and making a family there and blessing the area you're in? How would you encourage and challenge people who maybe they're in that phase?
Well, I'd start by talking about my not so noble motives in the beginning. I read several books about church growth stuff back in the early 90s. And I read one book about that it had in it, I think, the top 20 fastest growing churches in the United States. And even then it was dated. It's probably from the early 80s, honestly. And Elmer Town, I think, had written the book. And I looked at the book, and every one of the characteristics, he was looking at characteristics of all the pastors. With the exception of one of those pastors, all of them have been at their church at least 20 years. So I remember thinking at that time, there's something to longevity if the fastest growing churches are led by people who've been there 20 years. Back then, I thought it was just a neato fact that I need to apply to get my mega church, right? Because I came out here to start, Saddleback Part 2, that's why I came out here. And I thought I'd have a mega church in 5 to 7 years, and I'd be at 10,000 people by 10 years. I had these fantasies. And what I would say is what I've since learned is the reason that those are the fastest growing churches have that in common is because they're led by guys who have a story, like who have had to grow up. Because when you've been at a church for 2 decades, you can't keep preaching your same stuff all the time. They're tired of it, right? They've heard every one of your sermons. They've heard of all of your stories. They know every one of your illustrations, and your jokes aren't funny anymore. So if you're going to stay at a church for 20 years, you got to grow up. You have to evolve. You have to change. You have to come more in touch with yourself. You have to have a passionate love relationship with Jesus. So what I've realized on this side is that the power of staying is that you can't do your little tricks and gimmicks anymore. You have to move on to something else. So many pastors rotate after 5 years. Why? Because that's it. The church has got them. They figured them out. They got to move somewhere where people don't have it figured them out yet. So I would say that my unnoble motives coming out here was to kind of follow the principles of that book, because I wanted to do everything in my power to get Oasis to grow and to be a mega church. And I went through a dark night of the soul about 5 years into the venture, maybe 6 years in, where I realized I was not going to probably ever have a mega church, and it might not even last. And the church looked like it was going to die. And at that point, that was really the darkest time for me, and it was really the best time in the long run. When I look back and see what God did in my life, it was the hardest, but it was the best. But yeah, I had to accept the fact that I came here under the assumption that if I do things God's way, He's going to give me what I want. And then I did things Jesus' way. I didn't do things Jesus' way, I did my way. Then I repented of that, did things, started going to soul care, started like working on me. Then I stopped being the angry control freak guy that I had been. And I thought, well, now Jesus is going to give me what I want magically, because I'm not manipulating everybody. And He did it. And the church almost died. And it got worse after I repented. And then I got really angry with God and said, really, seriously, I'm going to do everything your way, and then you're going to let it die quicker. And then I had to walk into Jesus never promised that He was going to give me what I want, even if I gave Him what He wanted. He would just give me Him. And so when I realized the only thing Jesus promised me is Jesus, and I started loving the people, I realized I liked Him. And it was about 6 years into this, I started really enjoying the people. I was no longer like trying to manipulate them, and I just enjoyed them. And I fell in love with them. I'm like, wow, it'll be sad if this church dies. I really like these people. This is like my favorite church. And so, we're still small. We were doing pretty good about a year ago. I was looking at the numbers. I say pretty good for us. Like, consider this. We've been here almost 25 years, and twice we've averaged like in the 160s, which is really great for us out here. We're out in the Wild West, and we're not a mega church, never have been. So we were averaging like in the 160s 2 years ago, and it was like looking good. And then I did a series of things in addition to what God did through COVID, that if I was trying harder to sabotage Oasis, I don't know what I could have done. Like, I think I just sabotaged everything. So, after 2020, it was like great. I was like, I would hear these stories about people losing members and losing people and losing giving. And I'm like, wow, our giving's up, our attendance is up. Like, I'm ashamed to tell people. Well, 2021 hit. And let me tell you something. I went down from 2 services to 1 service. We changed locations. I illegally fired my assistant pastor and then backed out of that 5 days later, but then underwent discipline, and the church put me on discipline for a month. I mean, after being here 24 years, right, I go through discipline. And it was rough. I went to 25 plus hours of counseling, my wife and I, in August of last year. And we come out of this stuff, and here we are. In-person attendance is in the 90s now, in person. Now, nobody knows who's coming online, right? You all have devices, and we're just factoring in times some number, and we're guessing how many people we have online. But we're estimating that we're averaging like 130 something with online. It's painful. And so I'm constantly being reminded that I may have come out here to start a big church that would make me famous and feel self-important, but God's got me on a journey to do something else in my life and in their lives. And I keep being reminded of that right when I think, oh, I've learned that lesson, I figured that out. Now God's going to grow the church. He's like, no, remember, we already had that lesson. That doesn't happen. Like, that chapter doesn't get here. And I'm like, but eventually, right? So no, I don't think that I'm going to ever see that chapter.
But that story, your experience is so common. I think for a lot of us pastors and church leaders, we never get to the point of admitting that. We just leave and go somewhere else and think, well, those people suck. I've got to find a better group of people. This isn't growing fast enough. I'll go someplace that will. Right. So I think just you sharing that story and being transparent is huge and such an encouragement. I want to ask you about something that's been a big part of what God has done in your life and in the life of Oasis. And that is, you mentioned soul care. Potter's Wheel is kind of your method of soul care. So if you don't mind, just explain a little bit about what Potter's Wheel is and how God has used that in your life and the life of the church.
Okay, yeah. So when I went through that dark night of the soul, 2 things happened. I came to find out about the cell-based church. We can save that for another day. And the other thing that happened during that time is I went to Potter's Wheel 1. So Potter's Wheel 1, the summary of this is there's some good people here in Tucson, John and Patty Seepin, they're mentors of mine. They're in their late 70s. And back when they were young, they went out east, and they ended up at Grace Theological Seminary, Indiana. And they sat under a young guy named Dr. Larry Crabb and another guy named Dr. Dan Allender, right? They were just getting started in the classroom, and they were doing this whole new approach to counseling. And so John was in a degree program, a master's degree program, and Patty was invited because she was a spouse. She wasn't even getting a degree. She just sat in on the classes because she was allowed to. So they just took in all this stuff from Allender and Crabb. And then eventually they ended up as biblical counselors, made their way out west to Tucson, and started a lifetime of biblical counseling. And what they would do is they would take the 2 semesters of material they got from the main class that Crabb taught. They would take those 2 semesters and they would like offer it one night a week to a close, intimate group of people, and they would like pass it on. Well, then eventually some missionaries came to Patty, and this one female missionary said to Patty, would you come here and help the missionaries here by doing that stuff you do throughout the year? Could you do that like in 1 week? She said, I can't do that in 1 week. That takes a year. And she's like, I know, we don't have a year. Could you just give us something in a week that these missionaries are falling apart? They need help. So she said, well, I'll see what I can do. And so she took the 20 hours of one semester and decided to do it in the mornings for 5 days. And then she took the lab, the 20 hours of lab from that semester, and decided to put that in the afternoons. So she said, well, I could do 5 days, 8 hours a day, 40 hours, and I could get you the main gist. I don't know what it's going to look like and feel like though. And it was transforming, right? It was life-changing for these missionaries. She came home and she said to John, I think we have something here. I think doing this in 5 days so that people can't don't miss 20% of it, like doing it in 5 days in this intensive setting, I think did more than we usually see over the course of a semester. Well, she did 1 semester, right? So then Potter's Wheel 2 would be the same thing, but it was the second semester, right? So 2 5 days. Well, I went through this for the first time around 2003, I think, 2004, somewhere in there. And I was going through a dark night of the soul, and I was having a hard time. My church was dying. I was sort of angry, and I wasn't even in touch with my anger at that point. And I went through this 5-day intensive that was actually designed to be part 1 of a 2-part thing to help you learn how to offer soul care to others. So Potter's Wheel 1 focuses on you. It focuses on the log in your eye. So the idea of Potter's Wheel 1 is if we can recognize our story, how it's impacted us, why we do the things that we do, how that's related to our story, how what we did to survive as a kid is what we're doing to survive now, but also destroying all of our relationships. If we can begin to understand why we do what we do, and we can start really healing in some cases, but definitely repenting. That's the key, repenting. If we can begin to actively change the way we think and live, then we can be healthy enough to help somebody else take the speck out of their eye. So Potter's Wheel 2 is builds on Potter's Wheel 1, but the idea is more taking these concepts and learning to use them with other people to help other people, because I can't help you unless I'm working on me. So I went through Potter's Wheel 1 and then Potter's Wheel 2 6 months later, because it takes a while for you to really gradually, swallow these concepts, I think. And it was changing. It just life-changing. I mean, outside of salvation, the most powerful 2 weeks of my life. And it changed the way I viewed my wife and our marriage. It changed the way I related to my kids. It changed the way I related to leaders in our church. I slowly started finding out who I was and living out of my real identity, because I think I'd been living with a mask. I mean, I was in my mid-30s at this point. I've been living with a mask since I was about 12 years old, and I wasn't sure where the real me began. Mm-hmm. So it was a long process of me just kind of learning to offer my own heart. And eventually people saw the change in me. I had an administrative assistant I had for 10 years. She said, David, I don't know what Potter's Wheel 1 is, but after seeing how it changed you, sign me up. I want to do it, right? And so then that started happening. Some people would sign up just because they saw the difference it had made in other people's lives. Other people would hear about it and be terrified because there were lots of crying, it's painful. And people are like, yeah, I don't think I'll pass. But over time, a significant percentage of our own church has gone through this. And there's also a retreat that we do in 2 days that's kind of Potter's Wheel light. that just gives you the basic concepts and lets you have some small group time that's not as intensive. And it lets you kind of get some of these ideas without, getting baptized completely. And for some people, that's a better first taste of it, is to have like a whole church or a large number of people in the whole church go through it and get a taste of it. And then some people can go and get more of an intensive. But that's kind of what happened. And so a few years ago, I went through a internship with John and Patty. A really intensive internship that when they were telling me about it, I'm looking at them thinking, there's no way I'm going to pay to do this internship. Are you out of your mind? And then they said, and if you do this, we'll let you teach Potter's Wheel 1. I'm like, I'm in. That's what I want to do the rest of my life. So now Hope and I teach Potter's Wheel 1 and 2. And last year we did 6. Between the 2, 1 and 2, we do more Potter's Wheel 1s than 2s. But between the 2, we did 6 last year, and we're on schedule to do 6 this year. And our board of directors at Oasis has just been gracious and agreed to let me be bivocational. I don't get any money from that. All the money goes into Oasis, so I'm still getting just the Oasis pay. But they realize that more and more my calling is to the church at large and not just to Oasis. And a lot of the people that come through these things are pastors and their wives and other people in ministry. And it's the most fun thing I get to do. And I love doing it.
Well, David, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that sounds like a book in the making, if it hasn't already been started. So
It hasn't.
I would buy it. I would read it. So I know a lot of people who are watching and listening probably want to know a little bit more about not just your journey with Oasis, but this ministry called Potter's Wheel, and how soul care is what a lot of pastors are called to do. And some, it may be their primary calling. It may be their passion. So we'll put a link to your church and to Potter's Wheel information in our show notes so people can find out more about that, and they'll be able to reach out and get in touch with you as well. But I just want to say personally, thank you for being honest today about sharing your story. And thank you for sharing about a tool that God has used to encourage and to help you in your journey, because a lot of people who are probably watching and listening may have been in ministry for a long time, and maybe they're experiencing this frustration or anxiety or fear or anger or whatever may be going on, and they can't figure out how to put their finger on it. And maybe something like this will encourage them to take the next step they need to take care of their own souls so that they can help shepherd other souls. So thank you for sharing that today.
You guys are committed to disciple making, and that's something obviously that I'm committed to. And what I realized coming out west years ago, learning my model in college, right, was that there has to be other pieces to this, right? The cell was one piece, community, interacting with people of both genders and different ages. But another piece of this is soul care. Because what I realized is I'm trying to disciple somebody and they were sexually abused as a child, and we ignore that and the impact that had. Scripture memory is just not going to cut it. I mean, that's helpful, that's needed. You can't grow as a disciple without that. But I started realizing in my ministry that soul care was critical, because until we help people deal with like trauma, unless we help people, like, this one gal came to me a while back, and she clearly had issues trusting Jesus. So I'm just, trying to, gather information. At one point, asking her how she's doing. She's like, my back hurts. I'm like, why does your back hurt? Well, I don't sleep very much. Well, why don't you sleep very much? Well, I wake up a lot at night because the baby monitor goes off. Okay, so how long has that been going on? Well, my kid's 4. You have a baby monitor for a 4-year-old? And you're constantly waking up in the middle of the night? I think you could turn the baby monitor off at this point. And she's like, no, I can't, because I'm afraid. What are you afraid of? I'm afraid something happened to my kid. Has something ever happened to your kid? No. But you have a hard time trusting God with your kid. Yeah. Has God ever let you down with another kid before? And then she started crying. And she said, I had a miscarriage years ago, and I'm still not over it. And I said, so basically what you learned is Jesus did not protect that child. Therefore, how in the world can I trust him with this child? Is that true? And she goes, that's exactly it. Well, if I just say, well, trust God, I could just say, trust God, read some scripture, memorize some Bible stuff, but how's that going to help this mom who has to walk into with Jesus a lament of Jesus, where were you? And until she wrestles with God and hears from God about that miscarriage, she's going to keep that baby monitor on, and she's going to keep having back problems and struggles.
Mm.
No matter, she knows the right things, right? I think that's what I've learned in soul care is most of the people in our church know what to do, but they're not doing it. And so we as pastors have to ask, well, why aren't people doing it?
Mm.
Why are they stuck? And I think that's where I've learned soul care is a vital piece of any pastor's arsenal, right? Because if we don't do soul care with people, they're going to be stuck in ways that our sermons can't get them unstuck.
That's right.
It's also helped my preaching because, like the story of David and Bathsheba, I was talking to this with our assistant pastor at one point, and he was preaching on that passage, I think. And I was like, he had the big idea for me, right? That God shows up even in hard times, or God brings beautiful things out of evil and pain, something like that. And I said, do you understand what I meant by that big idea? He goes, yeah. She lost her kid and her husband. And I went, yeah, what else? What else? And he's like, well, that's it. I went, no, that's not it. What else? What else did she suffer? And he couldn't think of anything. I said, well, think about this. She was probably raped. And he goes, oh, well, some of the commentarians actually say that she, by bathing out in the open, egged it on. And I'm like, that's misogyny, man. Like, I would not say that from the pulpit if I were you. Don't even bring that commentary stuff up.
Let alone it doesn't
you're
say
gonna
that
have
she
women
bathed
who've
on
been
the roof.
raped. Yeah, you're gonna have women in our church who've been raped, and do not attack or even suggest that anyone ever has attacked Bathsheba. No, she was probably raped because when the king tells you to do something, you do it. It's not like the president. The king tells you, you do it. And I said, and her husband, of course, was murdered. He didn't just die, he was murdered. And then it's funny, after sharing this with my daughter, she said to me, and Dad, she had to marry her husband's murderer.
Yep.
And I didn't even think of that. And so I think in soul care, when I read stories, I see different nuances. I realize how it impacts people. I used to say things like, honor your mother and father. But then now, after soul care, I look out in the audience and I see people who've been like molested by their parents. And I realize I can't just unqualified say that. God can say that, because in Israel, if you molested your kids, you get rocks thrown at you until you stop breathing. And so nobody has to honor you anymore. You're dead. But this is in Israel. And so I'm looking at people who they're wanting to know with this confused look, how do I honor these people that took advantage of me? So I've realized my preaching is far more nuanced today. I don't say nearly as many black and white things as I used to. I qualify things a lot more because I look out and I see people that are broken, and I know how they're broken, and I know how they're probably hearing what I'm saying. So soul care not only changes people, it also changes your preaching. It changes you. It changes the church.
That's so good. So encouraging. And, I think as pastors and leaders, so often we can be like Andy's favorite counselor, Bob Newhart, who, when the lady comes with a problem, he says, stop it.
Stop it.
That doesn't work.
I show that clip during Potter's Wheel 1. Actually.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
Fantastic.
So, but what an encouragement, David, not just because you're my brother, but really what an encouragement of honesty, transparency, and a journey of God shaping you, using you, growing you still. And I know it's been an encouragement. We're, like Andy said, we're going to put some links in the show notes, but just thank you for sharing your heart. Thank you for sharing your story. Yeah.
And David, we're going to have a follow-up episode because we didn't have enough time to answer that question about Mark yet.
Mark. I don't think so. But
Embarrassing stories.
Everybody's been
He
probably
has more embarrassing stories on me, to be honest with you.
I think we've got our fair share. By the way, just full disclosure, I did share an embarrassing story about you Sunday in my sermon. But anyway.
I need to go hear that then.
It's the fire. Anyway, so I shared that one when I preach on James. But I do want to say.
And did you say an unnamed member of my family, or?
I probably should, yes. It's just so real when I mention real people. But anyway, I do want to say. What'd you say?
Pop up my picture and say, this guy,
no, I
my
did
brother,
not. I did not show your picture.
Pastor David Gainey.
No, I did not. But anyway, thank you for sharing. And listen, I'm going to say this, and I would say this with the camera on or off, but thank you for being an incredible example of a follower of Jesus, someone who loves others, and loves the Lord, and someone who pastors well. So just want to say that. And I know those watching and listening have been encouraged and equipped to lead as they make disciples, as they are disciples. So again, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you
The
again,
rest
David.
of you, we'll see you next time.